The sound of teenage laughter echoed through our front hallway like breaking glass, each giggle a tiny cut that I felt more deeply than I cared to admit. I stood in the kitchen, my hands still damp from washing the lunch dishes, listening to my 17-year-old daughter Thessaly bound up the stairs with her 3 closest friends from Westbridge Academy. Their voices carry that particular brand of adolescent cruelty that masquerades as humor, sharp and thoughtless in the way only teenagers can manage. God, Thess, your mom is like the perfect example of what I never want to become, I heard Cordelia Ashworth say, her voice dripping with the entitled disdain that came so naturally to children raised in privilege. Just standing around in her robe all day, being a total lazy housewife. My mom would literally die if she had nothing better to do than wash dishes and fold laundry. The chorus of agreement that followed felt like a physical blow. But it was Thessaly's response that truly shattered something inside me. Instead of defending me, instead of correcting her friend's assumptions, my own daughter laughed along with them. Not just a polite chuckle, but a genuine, enthusiastic laugh that suggested she not only agreed with the assessment, but found it genuinely amusing. I know, right? Thessaly's voice floated down the stairs, casual and careless. Sometimes I wonder what she even does all day. Like, Dad works so hard at the firm, and she just exists. It's kind of embarrassing, honestly. I gripped the edge of the granite countertop, my knuckles turning white as I processed what I just heard. 24 years of marriage, 17 years of motherhood, and this was how my own family saw me. A lazy housewife who simply existed while my husband Caspian brought home the real money and shouldered the real responsibilities. The irony was so profound it almost made me laugh. Almost. If only they knew. If only any of them had the slightest idea of what I actually did with my days, of the empire I'd built while they assumed I was sitting around in my pajamas watching daytime television and feeling sorry for myself. The assumption had become so entrenched in our family mythology that I'd stopped trying to correct it years ago. It had been easier, somehow, to let them believe what they wanted to believe than to deal with the complications that the truth would bring. But standing in my pristine kitchen, listening to my daughter dismiss me as a cautionary tale of female mediocrity, I felt something shift inside me. A door that had been locked for years suddenly swung open, and behind it was a fury so pure and focused that it took my breath away. I walked to my home office, a room that Caspian and Thessaly rarely entered, assuming it was just another space where I might occasionally pay household bills or organize family photos. They had no idea that behind the innocent facade of domestic organization lay the nerve center of an operation that generated more income in a single month than Caspian's prestigious law practice brought in during an entire quarter. My laptop sat exactly where I'd left it that morning, open to 3 different trading platforms and a secure messaging system that connected me to clients across 4 continents. The notifications were blinking steadily, each one representing another opportunity, another deal, another few $1,000s flowing into accounts that only I controlled. I'd been monitoring the market since 4 in the morning, making split-second decisions that most people couldn't comprehend and wouldn't have the stomach to execute even if they could. At 38 years old, I had accumulated a personal net worth that would have shocked every person in my life if they knew the truth. While Caspian earned a respectable $250,000 annually as a partner at Meridian, Blackstone and Associates, I had generated over $1.7 million in the past 12 months alone through a combination of cryptocurrency trading, foreign exchange speculation, and strategic investments in emerging technologies. The money sat in a complex web of accounts, trusts, and investment vehicles that I'd spent years constructing with the help of financial advisors who knew me only by encrypted communications and numbered accounts. Every transaction was legal. Every dollar was earned through my own skill and intuition, and every penny was mine and mine alone. I'd started trading seriously 8 years ago, initially just playing with small amounts while Thessaly was at school, and Caspian was consumed with building his career. What began as intellectual curiosity had evolved into something approaching artistic mastery. I had a gift for reading market patterns, for sensing the subtle shifts in global economic sentiment that preceded major price movements. While other people watched soap operas or went to yoga classes, I studied Japanese candlestick charts and monitored political developments in emerging markets. The secrecy hadn't been intentional at first. In the beginning, I'd mentioned my interest in trading to Caspian, but his response had been so dismissive, so patronizing, that I'd simply stopped bringing it up. He'd patted my hand and told me it was nice that I had a hobby, as if I were collecting stamps or learning watercolor painting. When my first major win netted me $43,000 in a single week, I'd tried again to share my success with him, but he'd been distracted by a difficult case and had barely listened. After a while, I realized that his dismissal worked in my favor. If he wasn't paying attention to my activities, then he wouldn't notice when those activities became increasingly sophisticated and profitable. The assumption that I was just puttering around the house gave me perfect cover for what had evolved into a full-time career that happened to be conducted from my kitchen table and home office. Now, standing in that office with my daughter's cruel words still echoing in my ears, I felt the weight of all those years of secret success. Every profitable trade, every strategic investment, every carefully calculated risk that had paid off spectacularly. They thought I was lazy. They thought I was useless. They thought I contributed nothing to our family beyond basic household maintenance. Tonight, I decided, would be different. Tonight at dinner, I would tell them exactly what I'd been doing with my days and exactly how much money I'd been making, while they assumed I was the stereotypical unemployed wife living off my husband's generosity. The afternoon passed with agonizing slowness. I watched the markets close in New York, monitored the opening in Tokyo, and executed 2 small trades that netted me $11,000 before Thessaly's friends even left our house. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me that while they'd been upstairs mocking my supposed laziness, I'd been downstairs making more money in 3 hours than most people earned in 4 months. Caspian arrived home at his usual time, 6:30 in the evening, looking every inch the successful attorney in his tailored suit and Italian leather shoes. He kissed my cheek absently, asked about my day in the same tone he might use to inquire about the weather, and went upstairs to change into more casual clothes. His assumption that my day had been uneventful and unremarkable was so automatic that he didn't even wait for an answer. Thessaly emerged from her room when I called for dinner, her earlier cruelty apparently forgotten as she focused on her phone and whatever social drama was currently consuming her attention. She took her seat at our mahogany dining table without looking up from her screen. her thumbs moving rapidly across the keyboard as she responded to messages with the same casual thoughtlessness that had characterized her assessment of my life. I'd prepared Caspian's favorite meal, grilled salmon with roasted vegetables and wild rice, not because I felt particularly generous toward him after overhearing how little he thought of my contributions, but because I wanted this evening to be memorable for all the right reasons. When people look back on this night, I wanted them to remember the excellent food, the comfortable setting, the calm before the storm that was about to reshape everything they thought they knew about our family dynamics. "How was your day, darling?" Caspian asked, as he settled into his chair, his attention already drifting toward the legal brief he'd brought to the table, despite my long-standing rule about work materials during family meals. "Productive," I replied, setting his plate in front of him with perhaps more force than necessary. "Very productive, actually." Thessaly glanced up from her phone for the first time since sitting down, probably registering something unusual in my tone. "Did you finally finish organizing the basement? You've been threatening to do that for forever." The basement? She thought my productive day had involved sorting through holiday decorations and old college textbooks. The misconception was so profound that I almost admired its completeness. They'd constructed an entire alternative reality in which I existed purely as a supporting character in their much more important lives. "No, sweetheart," I said, taking my own seat and folding my hands carefully in my lap. "I didn't organize the basement today. I had other priorities." Caspian looked up from his brief, perhaps sensing something different in the atmosphere. "Everything all right, Serafina? You seem a bit tense." After 17 years of marriage, his emotional vocabulary for describing my state of mind remained remarkably limited. I could have been furious, heartbroken, exhilarated, or plotting world domination, and he would have described it all as a bit tense. "I'm fine," I assured him, cutting my salmon with surgical precision. "Actually, I wanted to talk to both of you about something important, something I should have discussed years ago." Thessaly's phone finally went face down on the table, my serious tone apparently penetrating even her adolescent self-absorption. "What's wrong? Are you guys getting divorced or something?" "Nothing's wrong," I said, though the question revealed how little trust existed in our family relationships. The fact that her first assumption was marital catastrophe said more about the foundation of our household than I cared to acknowledge. "I just think it's time for some honesty about what I actually do with my time." Caspian set down his fork, giving me his full attention for the first time in weeks. "I don't understand. What do you mean, what you do with your time? You take care of the house, you manage Thessaly's schedule, you handle the household finances. We've never questioned your contributions." The word contributions hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that made my jaw clench. Contributions, as if I were a volunteer worker whose efforts were appreciated but not particularly valuable, as if my role in our family was supplementary rather than essential. "That's interesting, Caspian, because based on what I overheard this afternoon, it seems like my contributions are viewed quite differently by the people who matter most to me." Thessaly's face went pale, and I saw her gaze flick nervously between her father and me. "Mom, if this is about what Cordelia said, she was just being stupid. You know how she is." "Actually, sweetheart, this isn't about what Cordelia said. This is about what you said, about how you agreed with her assessment that I'm a lazy housewife who just exists while your father does all the real work." The silence that followed was deafening. Caspian looked confused, clearly trying to piece together a conversation he hadn't witnessed. Thessaly looked mortified, finally understanding that her casual cruelty had consequences. "I didn't mean it like that," she whispered, but we both knew she had meant it exactly like that. "I think," I said, my voice steady and calm, "that it's time both of you understood exactly what I've been doing with my days for the past 8 years. Because contrary to popular belief in this household, I haven't been sitting around in my pajamas feeling sorry for myself." I reached for the folder I'd placed beside my chair, the one containing printouts of account statements, trading records, and tax documents that told the real story of my daily activities. The paper felt heavy in my hands, weighted with years of secret accomplishments and private victories. "For the past 8 years," I continued, "while you both assumed I was playing the role of the stereotypical unemployed wife, I've been building something significant, something that might surprise you." Caspian leaned forward, his lawyer instincts kicking in as he recognized the formal tone that preceded important revelations. "Serafina, what are you talking about?" I opened the folder and spread the first page across the table, a summary statement that showed my total portfolio value as of the close of business that day. The number at the bottom of the page was clear and undeniable, printed in bold black ink that left no room for misinterpretation. I'm talking about the fact that while you earn $250,000 a year as a partner at one of the city's most prestigious law firms, I've generated over $1.7 million in the past 12 months through trading and investments. The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence of our dining room. Thessaly's mouth fell open in shock. Caspian stared at the document as if it were written in a foreign language. "That's impossible," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "There must be some mistake." I pulled out the next document, a detailed breakdown of my most successful trades from the previous quarter. "No mistake, darling. This trade here, executed last Tuesday while you were in court arguing the Henderson case, netted me $87,000 in 6 hours. This one from 3 weeks ago brought in $123,000 overnight when the yen moved against the dollar exactly as I'd predicted." Thessaly grabbed the papers with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the numbers as if they might rearrange themselves into something more comprehensible. "Mom, this can't be real. Where did this money come from? How is this even possible?" "It's possible," I explained, "because while you both assumed I was too lazy and stupid to do anything meaningful with my life, I was teaching myself to read global markets, studying economic indicators, and developing an intuitive understanding of currency fluctuations that apparently comes quite naturally to me." Caspian was still staring at the first document, his face cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been admiration. "Serafina, if this is real, if these numbers are accurate, then you're a millionaire, several times over." "Yes," I said simply, "I am." The weight of that admission settled over our dining room like a heavy blanket. For years, our family's financial identity had been built around Caspian's success, his partnerships, his professional achievements. I had been the supportive wife, the grateful beneficiary of his hard work and ambition. The idea that I might have my own wealth, my own professional accomplishments, my own claim to financial independence had never even occurred to them. "Why didn't you tell us?" Thessaly asked, her voice small and confused. "Why keep it secret?" I looked at my daughter, this beautiful, intelligent young woman who had somehow learned to see her own mother as a cautionary tale of feminine mediocrity because, sweetheart, the first few times I tried to share my success with your father, he dismissed it as a cute hobby. Because when I mentioned making money trading currencies, he patted my hand and told me it was nice that I had something to keep me busy. Because both of you were so convinced that the only valuable work in this family was happening at Meridian Blackstone and Associates that you couldn't imagine I might be capable of something equally impressive. Caspian set down the documents and ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his way of processing information that didn't fit his existing worldview. But why continue the secrecy? Why not force us to pay attention? The question revealed so much about how he still didn't understand. Force them to pay attention, as if my accomplishments were only valuable if they commanded his acknowledgement. Because, I said, after a while, I realized that your dismissal actually worked in my favor. If you weren't paying attention to what I was doing, then you wouldn't try to control it or manage it or offer unwanted advice about how I should be investing my money. The secrecy gave me freedom to develop my own expertise without interference. I pulled out another document, this one showing the complex trust structure I'd established to protect and grow my assets. Over the past 3 years, I've also been working with estate planning attorneys and tax specialists to ensure that my wealth is properly protected and efficiently managed. I have accounts in 7 different countries, investments in 4 emerging markets, and a cryptocurrency portfolio that's performed better than any traditional investment vehicle available to retail investors. Thessaly was shaking her head in amazement, still trying to process the fundamental shift in how she understood our family dynamics. So, when we thought you were just hanging around the house doing nothing, you were actually making all this money? More than just making money, I corrected. I was building expertise, developing relationships with financial advisors and other traders, studying market trends, and creating a sustainable system for generating wealth that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval or support. The transformation in how they were looking at me was almost physically palpable. An hour ago, I had been the lazy housewife, the embarrassing example of unfulfilled female potential. Now, suddenly, I was a mysterious figure they'd never really known, a financial success story that had been hiding in plain sight. The irony, I continued, is that while you were both so focused on Caspian's career and Thessaly's academic achievements, you completely overlooked the fact that the highest earner in this family has been the person you assumed contributed the least. Caspian leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from shock to something that looked almost like respect. Serafina, this is extraordinary. I had no idea you had this kind of talent for finance. Where did you learn all of this? The same place I learned everything else that seemed to surprise you over the years, I replied. I taught myself. I studied, I practiced, I made mistakes, I learned from them, and I got better. Just like I did when I taught myself to cook, when I learned to manage our household budget, when I figured out how to navigate Thessaly's school bureaucracy. The difference is that this time, no one was watching or judging or offering suggestions about how I could do it better. The quiet that followed was different from the earlier silence. This wasn't the stunned shock of unexpected revelation, but the thoughtful processing of people trying to recalibrate their understanding of someone they thought they knew completely. So what happens now? Thessaly asked finally. I mean, what does this mean for us, for our family? It was a good question, and one I'd been considering all afternoon as I'd prepared for this conversation. What had happened now? How did a family move forward when the fundamental assumptions about power, contribution, and value had been completely overturned? That depends, I said, on whether you're both willing to acknowledge that you might have been wrong about me, whether you're capable of seeing me as something other than a supporting character in your much more important lives. The words carried weight because they reflected years of accumulated resentment, years of feeling invisible and undervalued in my own home. But they also carried hope because for the first time in years, I felt like I was speaking from a position of strength rather than defensive vulnerability. Caspian reached across the table and took my hand, his touch tentative and uncertain. Serafina, I owe you an apology. We both do. I can't believe I was so blind to what you were accomplishing. The blindness wasn't accidental, I pointed out gently. It was comfortable for both of you to see me as the grateful dependent rather than acknowledge that I might have my own ambitions and capabilities. Thessaly pushed her chair back from the table and walked around to where I was sitting, wrapping her arms around my shoulders in a hug that felt different from the perfunctory embraces we'd shared recently. Mom, I'm so sorry. What I said today was horrible and wrong, and I didn't even realize how horrible and wrong it was until right now. The apology felt genuine, but I could also see the calculation behind it. She was beginning to understand that her dismissive attitude toward me might have consequences she hadn't considered. If I was capable of generating this kind of wealth independently, then I was also capable of making decisions about how that wealth would be used and who would benefit from it. Apologies are appreciated, I said, but what I really need is acknowledgement that this conversation represents a fundamental shift in how we relate to each other. I'm not asking for your permission to be successful. I'm informing you that I already am successful, and going forward, I expect to be treated accordingly. The statement hung between us, clear and uncompromising. I wasn't negotiating for better treatment or asking them to reconsider their assumptions. I was establishing new ground rules based on the reality of who I actually was rather than who they'd assumed me to be. Caspian was still studying the financial documents, his lawyer's mind trying to process the legal and practical implications of what he was learning. Serafina, if these numbers are accurate, and I have no reason to doubt that they are, then you've essentially been supporting this family financially for years without us even knowing it. Not supporting, I corrected, supplementing. Your income covers our basic expenses and lifestyle. My income has been building our long-term security and creating opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. I pulled out the final document from my folder, a detailed projection showing how my current investment trajectory would affect our family's net worth over the next decade. Based on current performance trends and market projections, by the time Thessaly graduates from college, my portfolio should be worth somewhere between $8 and $12 million. The number seemed to reverberate in the air between us. $8 to $12 million. More money than any of us had ever imagined having, generated by the woman they'd assumed was too lazy and unambitious to contribute anything meaningful to our family's success. Jesus, Thessaly whispered, sinking back into her chair. Mom, you're like actually rich, really, really rich. Yes, I confirmed, I am. The simplicity of that statement seemed to encompass everything that had changed in our family dynamic over the course of a single dinner conversation. I was rich, I was successful, I was capable and accomplished and powerful in ways they had never imagined. And most importantly, I was no longer willing to pretend otherwise for the sake of their comfort. But even as I felt the satisfaction of finally revealing the truth, I knew that this conversation was only the beginning. Money changes everything, especially within families. The revelation of my wealth would reshape not just how they saw me, but how they saw themselves, how they understood our relationships, and how they planned for their own futures. As we sat there in the aftermath of these revelations, surrounded by the evidence of my hidden success, I realized that I had opened a door that could never be closed again. The comfortable fiction of our previous family dynamic was gone forever, replaced by a new reality that none of us were quite prepared to navigate. And tomorrow, we would all have to figure out what came next. The morning arrived with an unusual heaviness, as if the very air in our house had thickened overnight with the weight of unspoken implications. I woke before dawn, as I always did, but instead of immediately reaching for my laptop to check the Asian markets, I lay in bed, listening to Caspian's steady breathing and contemplating how fundamentally everything had changed in the span of a single dinner conversation. He stirred beside me as the first light filtered through our bedroom curtains, and I felt his consciousness return in stages. First, the subtle shift in his breathing pattern, then the slight tensing of his muscles as his mind engaged with the day ahead. Finally, the moment when full awareness crashed over him and he remembered what he'd learned about his wife of 24 years. "Serafina," he said quietly, his voice thick with sleep and uncertainty. "Last night, that was all real, wasn't it?" "Yes," I replied, not turning to face him yet. "It was all real." He was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his analytical lawyer's mind as he tried to process the legal, financial, and emotional implications of what he'd discovered. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a note of something I couldn't quite identify. Respect, perhaps, or maybe wariness. "I keep thinking about all the times I dismissed your questions about investments or market trends," he said. "All the times I assumed you were just making conversation when you mentioned something you'd read about cryptocurrency or foreign exchange rates." The admission hung between us, heavy with the recognition of how thoroughly he'd underestimated me. But there was something else in his tone, something that made me finally turn to look at him. His expression was troubled, and I realized he was grappling with more than just surprise at my hidden success. "What is it?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew what was bothering him. He sat up against the headboard, running his hands through his graying hair in that familiar gesture of professional perplexity. "The legal implications, Serafina. If you've been generating this kind of income for years without my knowledge, there are tax considerations, estate planning issues, potential marital property complications that we need to address." And there it was. Less than 12 hours after learning that his wife was a financial genius who'd been supporting their family's long-term security without acknowledgement or appreciation, he was already trying to figure out how to manage and control what I'd built. "Caspian," I said, my voice carefully measured, "are you seriously suggesting that you need to take over the legal management of my investments?" "Not take over," he said quickly, but I could see the defensive posture that indicated he knew exactly how his words had sounded. "But surely you understand that there are professional considerations here. Tax optimization strategies, liability protection structures, compliance issues that might benefit from legal oversight." I sat up as well, feeling the familiar surge of frustration that had characterized so many of our interactions over the years. Even faced with undeniable proof of my competence and success, his instinct was still to assume that I needed his professional guidance to manage what I'd already been managing brilliantly on my own. "I have attorneys," I said quietly. "I have tax specialists. I have a team of financial advisors who've been helping me structure these investments for maximum protection and efficiency. What I don't have is a husband who trusts that I might actually know what I'm doing." The words hit him like a physical blow, and I watched him realize that his immediate impulse to offer professional assistance had revealed exactly how little his fundamental assumptions about me had actually changed. He might be impressed by my success, but he still couldn't quite believe that I'd achieved it without needing his guidance. "That's not what I meant," he said, but we both knew it was exactly what he'd meant. "Isn't it?" I asked. "Less than 12 hours ago, you learned that your supposedly lazy, unproductive wife has been generating more income than you do, and your first instinct is to figure out how you can insert yourself into managing what I've built." He was quiet for a long moment, clearly recognizing the uncomfortable truth in my observation. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, more uncertain than I'd heard it in years. "I don't know how to process this, Serafina. For our entire marriage, I've thought of myself as the provider, the one responsible for our family's financial security. Learning that you've been doing that job better than I have, without my knowledge or involvement, is challenging." The admission was more honest than I'd expected, and I felt some of my anger soften into something approaching compassion. It couldn't be easy for a man who'd built his identity around professional success and financial responsibility to discover that his wife had been outperforming him for years. "I'm not trying to diminish your contributions," I said gently. "Your income has provided the foundation that allowed me to take the risks necessary for this kind of success. But I need you to understand that going forward, my financial activities are not a hobby that requires your oversight. They're a legitimate business that I've been operating successfully for years." Before he could respond, we heard movement in the hallway outside our bedroom, followed by a soft knock on our door. Thessaly's voice came through the wood, tentative and uncertain. "Mom? Dad? Are you awake? I need to talk to you about something." I glanced at Caspian, who looked as surprised as I felt. Our daughter was not typically an early riser, and she almost never sought out serious conversations with both parents simultaneously. The events of the previous evening had clearly affected her more profoundly than I had initially realized. "Come in, sweetheart," I called, pulling on my robe as Caspian quickly grabbed a t-shirt from the dresser. Thessaly entered our bedroom looking younger than her 17 years. Her long, dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her face bare of the carefully applied makeup that had become her armor for facing the world. She perched on the edge of our bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I couldn't sleep," she said without preamble. "I kept thinking about everything you told us last night, and I realized there are things I need to say, things I need to ask, and I can't wait anymore." I settled back against my pillows, giving her my full attention. "What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking about what Cordelia said yesterday, about how she never wants to become like you," Thessaly began, her voice gaining strength as she continued. "And I realized that she's right, but not in the way she meant." I felt Caspian tense beside me, clearly unsure where this conversation was heading. I wasn't entirely certain myself. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. Thessaly took a deep breath. as if gathering courage for what came next. I don't want to become someone who's so focused on what other people think that I can't see what's really happening in my own family. I don't want to be so worried about fitting in with people like Cordelia that I dismiss the people who actually matter. The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, and I could see her struggling with the recognition that her social circle's values might not align with what actually mattered in life. Cordelia's mom doesn't work, she continued. She goes to charity luncheons and sits on nonprofit boards and spends her days shopping and getting spa treatments. And Cordelia thinks that's better than what you do because it looks more important from the outside. I nodded, understanding the social dynamics that had shaped my daughter's perceptions. In our affluent community, there was indeed a hierarchy among non-working wives, with visible charitable activities ranking higher than invisible domestic contributions. But now I know that while Cordelia's mom was having her nails done and planning fundraising galas, you were making more money than her dad does as a neurosurgeon, Thessaly said, a note of wonder still evident in her voice. And I think that's actually incredible. The praise felt good, but I could sense there was more she needed to say. The thing is, she continued, I don't really understand how any of this works. I don't know what currency trading means or how you make money by buying and selling things I can't even see. And I realized that I've never asked you to teach me anything important, because I assumed you didn't know anything important. The admission was painful in its honesty, but I appreciated her willingness to acknowledge the assumptions that had shaped our relationship. I was wondering, she said, her voice becoming smaller and more uncertain, if maybe you could teach me about investing and money management and how to understand markets. Because if I'm going to inherit any of this someday, I should probably know how it works, right? The question caught me completely off guard. In all my planning and preparation for the previous evening's revelation, I hadn't considered the possibility that Thessaly might want to learn about the work that had consumed so much of my time and energy. You want to learn about trading? I asked, making sure I'd understood correctly. I want to learn about everything, she said with growing confidence. I want to understand how you analyze market trends and make investment decisions. I want to know how you've been making all this money while I thought you were just existing. The word existing carried the weight of her earlier cruelty, but now it was spoken with recognition and regret rather than dismissive contempt. And I want to understand what this means for college, she added, her voice taking on a practical note that reminded me of myself at her age. Because if you've got millions of dollars, then I don't need to worry about scholarships or student loans, right? I can focus on choosing schools based on what I want to study rather than what we can afford. The question revealed how much thought she'd already given to the practical implications of my revelation, but it also highlighted an assumption that made me pause. That depends, I said carefully, on whether you think you're automatically entitled to benefit from wealth you had no hand in creating. Both Thessaly and Caspian looked startled by my response, clearly expecting that my money would naturally become family money without any conditions or expectations attached. What do you mean? Thessaly asked, confusion evident in her voice. I mean that this money represents years of work, risk, and expertise that I developed independently, I explained. The fact that I'm married to your father and that you're my daughter doesn't automatically give you claims on what I've built. The silence that followed was charged with tension as both of them processed the implications of what I'd said. I could see Caspian's lawyer instincts engaging as he considered the legal ramifications of my position, while Thessaly looked genuinely shocked at the suggestion that my wealth might not automatically benefit her. "But we're family," she said finally, her voice small and uncertain. "Yes, we are," I agreed. "And part of being family means earning respect and consideration rather than simply assuming it's owed to you." I could see both of them struggling with this perspective, with the idea that my newfound financial power came with conditions and expectations rather than simply expanding their opportunities without requiring anything from them in return. "However," I continued, watching relief flood their faces, "I'm not suggesting that I won't share what I've built with the people I love. I'm suggesting that going forward, our family relationships need to be based on mutual respect and recognition rather than assumptions about who contributes what." Thessaly nodded eagerly, clearly willing to agree to whatever terms would ensure her continued access to the financial security my success provided. "So you'll pay for college?" she asked, unable to hide her relief. "I'll pay for college," I confirmed. "If you earn it, if you treat your education seriously, if you show respect for the opportunity you're being given, and if you demonstrate that you understand the value of what's being provided for you." The conditions weren't unreasonable, but they represented a fundamental shift from the previous assumption that she was entitled to my support regardless of her behavior or attitude. "And I'll teach you about investing and financial management," I added, "if you're genuinely interested in learning rather than just securing your inheritance." Her face lit up with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen from her in years. "I am interested. Really, truly interested. I want to understand how you did all this." I looked at Caspian, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange. "And what about you? Are you prepared to accept that your wife has her own professional expertise that doesn't require your oversight or management?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him wrestling with concepts that challenged his fundamental understanding of our relationship and his role in our family. "I'm prepared to try," he said finally. "I'm prepared to acknowledge that I've been wrong about a lot of things, and that I need to learn to see you differently than I have been." It wasn't the wholehearted endorsement I might have hoped for, but it was honest, and I appreciated his willingness to admit that change would be difficult for him. "Good," I said, "because there are some other things we need to discuss about how our family operates going forward." Both of them looked apprehensive, clearly wondering what other revelations or changes might be coming. "First," I said, "I want to establish some new ground rules about how we treat each other in this house. Thessaly, the casual dismissiveness you showed toward me yesterday can never happen again. If you disagree with my choices or question my contributions, we can discuss that respectfully, but I will not tolerate being mocked or dismissed in my own home." She nodded quickly, clearly understanding that her access to my financial support was contingent on treating me with basic respect. "Second," I continued, turning to Caspian, "I need you to understand that my trading activities are not a cute hobby that occasionally generates pocket money. This is a serious business that requires concentration, analysis, and uninterrupted time. I can't have you wandering into my office during market hours to ask about dinner plans or weekend activities." He looked slightly chastened, but nodded his agreement. "Third," I said, addressing both of them, "I want us to start having weekly family meetings where we discuss not just logistics and schedules, but actual substantive topics. I want to know what you're both working on, what challenges you're facing, what goals you're pursuing. And I want to share what I'm doing with my work, my successes, and my concerns." The idea of regular family meetings seemed to surprise them both, but neither objected. "Finally," I said, I think we all need to acknowledge that this family has been operating on some unhealthy assumptions for years, and changing those patterns is going to take time and effort from all of us. Over the following weeks, our household settled into new rhythms that reflected the changed dynamics of our relationships. Cecily began joining me in my office for an hour each morning before school, learning about market analysis and investment strategies with an enthusiasm that surprised us both. Her questions were insightful, and she demonstrated a natural aptitude for understanding complex financial concepts that reminded me of myself at her age. Caspian struggled more with the adjustment, clearly finding it difficult to relinquish his role as the primary financial authority in our family. There were moments of tension when his instinct to offer unwanted advice clashed with my insistence on maintaining independence over my work. But gradually, he began to recognize that my success wasn't a threat to his own accomplishments, but rather an enhancement to our family's overall security and prospects. The changes weren't limited to our immediate family. Word of my financial success spread through our social circle, though I was careful to control the narrative and protect the specific details of my wealth. The reaction from other wives in our community was fascinating to observe, ranging from genuine admiration to barely concealed resentment that I'd achieved something they hadn't thought to attempt. Cordelia Ashworth's mother, Margaret, was particularly interesting to watch as she processed the news that the woman she'd dismissed as a lazy housewife was actually more financially successful than her neurosurgeon husband. The shift in how she treated me at social gatherings was subtle but unmistakable. Her previous condescension replaced by a careful respect that acknowledged my changed status in our community's informal hierarchy. More importantly, the revelation had profound effects on how Thessaly related to me and understood her own potential. She began asking more substantive questions about my work, showing genuine curiosity about market dynamics and investment strategies. Our relationship, which had been strained by years of mutual misunderstanding, began to develop into something more like a partnership between teacher and student. One evening in late spring, about 3 months after our dinner table revelation, Thessaly approached me in my office as I was reviewing portfolio performance for the quarter. "Mom," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk that had become her regular spot during our morning sessions, "I've been thinking about something and I want to run it by you." I minimized my trading platforms and gave her my full attention. "What's on your mind?" "I've been looking at college programs and I found something interesting," she said, pulling out a folder that she'd clearly prepared carefully. "There's a specialized program at Wharton that focuses on quantitative finance and algorithmic trading. It's like what you do, but with more mathematical modeling and computer programming." I felt a surge of pride at her initiative in researching educational opportunities that aligned with what she'd been learning from me. "That sounds fascinating. Tell me more about it." She opened her folder and spread out printed pages from the university's website. Her presentation as organized and professional as any client pitch I'd received from financial advisors. The program combines advanced mathematics, computer science, and economic theory to develop trading algorithms and risk management systems, she explained, clearly having memorized key details. Graduates typically go to work for hedge funds or investment banks, developing the kind of automated systems that execute trades faster than humans can think. The sophistication of her research impressed me, But I was even more struck by the enthusiasm in her voice as she described a potential career path that built on what I'd taught her. "There's more," she said, her excitement growing. I reached out to the admissions office and spoke with Professor Nathaniel Foxworth, who runs the program. When I told him about what you've accomplished as an independent trader, he was really interested in meeting you. He said most of their students come from traditional financial backgrounds, but they're always looking for people with innovative approaches to market analysis. The fact that she'd taken the initiative to contact the program directly and had presented my work in a way that generated professional interest demonstrated a level of maturity and strategic thinking that I hadn't fully appreciated before. "He's going to be in the city next month for a conference," she continued, "and he invited both of us to have lunch with him. He wants to discuss your trading strategies and see if there might be opportunities for you to guest lecture or contribute to their research." I stared at my daughter. This young woman who had somehow transformed from the dismissive teenager, mocking her lazy housewife mother, into a sophisticated advocate for my professional accomplishments. "Thessaly," I said quietly, "that's absolutely brilliant work on your part. I'm impressed by your research, your initiative, and your professional presentation." She beamed at the praise, but I could see there was something else she wanted to say. "The thing is," she said, her voice becoming more serious, "I don't just want to study what you do. I want to understand why you hid it for so long, and I want to make sure that when I'm successful at something, I don't feel like I have to keep it secret from the people who matter to me." The observation was profound in its simplicity, cutting to the heart of what had driven my years of secrecy and the family dynamics that had made that secrecy feel necessary. "You're right," I acknowledged. "I hope that by the time you're my age, you'll be in relationships that celebrate your success rather than dismissing it, and that you'll have the confidence to insist on recognition rather than accepting invisibility." That evening at dinner, as Thessaly enthusiastically described her research and her contact with Professor Foxworth, I watched Caspian's reaction carefully. There was pride in his expression as he listened to our daughter's ambitious plans, but there was also something else that I found encouraging: genuine respect for the work I'd been doing and recognition that Thessaly's interest in finance represented a legitimate intellectual pursuit rather than a frivolous hobby. "It sounds like you've inherited your mother's talent for this kind of analysis," he said to Thessaly, and I noticed that he said inherited rather than developed or learned. The word choice suggested that he now viewed my financial abilities as a genuine skill, worthy of being passed down to the next generation. "Actually," Thessaly said, "I think it's more that Mom finally had someone who was interested in learning what she already knew. The talent was always there, but nobody was paying attention. The insight was remarkably astute for someone her age, and it highlighted how much our relationship had evolved since that first morning when she joined me in my office with genuine curiosity rather than obligatory politeness." Over the following months, our family continued to adapt to our new dynamic. The lunch with Professor Foxworth was a tremendous success, leading not only to Thessaly's acceptance into Wharton's specialized program, but also to an invitation for me to serve as a guest lecturer for their course on alternative investment strategies. The recognition from an academic institution that my work had intellectual merit was deeply satisfying, validating years of self-directed learning and independent success. More importantly, the experience gave Thessaly a preview of what it meant to be taken seriously as a financial professional, to have her questions and insights treated with respect rather than condescension. I could see her confidence growing as she realized that the skills she was developing were genuinely valuable and that her interest in finance was being validated by respected experts in the field. Caspian's adjustment took longer, but was ultimately more profound. The process of truly accepting that his wife was not only financially successful, but professionally respected, required him to examine some fundamental assumptions about masculinity, marriage, and family roles that he'd never questioned before. There were difficult conversations about his need to control and manage versus his ability to support and celebrate, but gradually, he began to find ways to be proud of my success without feeling diminished by it. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect, but it was real and meaningful. By the time Thessaly left for college that fall, our family had developed new patterns of communication and respect that felt sustainable and authentic. On the evening before Thessaly's departure for Philadelphia, we sat together in my office, reviewing the investment account I'd established for her college expenses and future financial security. The account contained enough money to fund not only her undergraduate education, but also graduate school, a house down payment, or whatever other opportunities she might want to pursue. "Mom," she said as we finished reviewing the account statements, "there's something I want you to know." I looked up from the paperwork, giving her my full attention. "That day when I called you a lazy housewife, when I laughed along with Cordelia's horrible comments about you," she said, her voice heavy with regret that hadn't faded over the months since our revelation dinner. "I knew it was wrong even as I was saying it. I knew you weren't lazy. I knew you contributed more to our family than I was acknowledging. But it was easier to go along with what my friends expected than to defend you." The admission was painful, but not surprising. Teenagers often prioritize peer acceptance over family loyalty, and I'd understood that even at the time. "The thing is," she continued, "I've been thinking about why I was so willing to dismiss you, and I think it's because I was scared that if I acknowledged how capable and accomplished you were, then I'd have to live up to that example. It was easier to pretend you weren't doing anything important than to worry about whether I could ever be as good as you." The insight was remarkably mature, showing a level of self-awareness that impressed me. But it also revealed something about our family dynamic that I hadn't fully understood before. "So when you found out about the money and the trading and everything," she said, "part of me was terrified because suddenly I couldn't pretend anymore that you weren't accomplished. I had to face the fact that my mother is actually extraordinary and that maybe I should try to be extraordinary too." I reached across the desk and took her hand, feeling the weight of this moment in our relationship. "Sweetheart," I said gently, "I never needed you to be extraordinary. I just needed you to see me clearly and to treat me with the same respect you'd show any other adult whose accomplishments you admired." "I know that now," she said, "and I want you to know that I'm not going to college just to study finance because you're good at it. I'm going because I genuinely love this kind of analysis and because I've discovered that I'm actually good at it too." The distinction was important, and I appreciated her need to establish her own motivation and identity, separate from simply following in my footsteps. "I'm proud of you," I told her, "not just for your academic achievements or your financial aptitude, but for your willingness to examine your own behavior and grow from it." As I watched Thessaly pack her belongings for college, carefully including the financial textbooks and market analysis guides that had become her favorite reading material, I reflected on how dramatically our family had changed in the space of less than a year. The revelation of my hidden wealth had been the catalyst, But the real transformation had been in how we learned to see and value each other. Caspian appeared in the doorway of Thessaly's room, watching her pack with the mixture of pride and melancholy that characterized every parent sending their child off to college. "I keep thinking about that dinner," he said quietly, "when you told us about the trading and the money. I keep wondering how different things might have been if I'd paid attention earlier, if I'd shown more interest in what you were doing." It was a conversation we'd had in various forms over the past months, his need to process his regret warring with my desire to move forward rather than dwelling on missed opportunities. "You're paying attention now," I reminded him. "That's what matters." "But I wasted so many years," he said, the frustration evident in his voice. "So many years when I could have been learning from you, when we could have been partners in this, instead of me just assuming you were less than you are." The regret was genuine, but I'd learned over the months since our revelation that dwelling on past mistakes was less productive than focusing on current possibilities. "Caspian," I said, turning to face him fully, "what matters isn't that you didn't see me clearly before. What matters is that you're choosing to see me clearly now, and that you're willing to build our relationship on who we actually are rather than who we assumed we were." He nodded, but I could see he was still struggling with the lost time and missed opportunities. "Besides," I added with a slight smile, "I rather enjoyed having my secret empire for a while. There was something liberating about knowing that I was more capable and successful than anyone realized." The comment made him laugh, breaking some of the tension that had been building around our conversation. "Our daughter is going to be formidable," he observed, watching Thessaly efficiently organize her belongings with the same methodical approach she'd brought to learning about investments. "She already is," I corrected. "She just needed to discover it for herself." Later that evening, after Thessaly had finished packing and gone to bed, Caspian and I sat together in my office reviewing the portfolio performance for the quarter. It had become a monthly ritual, him learning to understand the complexity of what I did while I practiced explaining my strategies to someone without extensive financial background. "Your cryptocurrency holdings performed exceptionally well this quarter," he observed, studying the detailed reports I'd prepared for our review session. "The key was recognizing early that institutional adoption would drive demand faster than most analysts predicted," I explained. "While everyone else was focused on regulatory concerns, I was watching the patterns of corporate treasury allocation." He nodded thoughtfully, and I could see him processing not just the financial information, but the analytical sophistication required to identify and capitalize on such opportunities. "Serafina," he said, setting down the reports and looking at me directly, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you recognition for what you've accomplished and acknowledgement that you've been the most successful financial professional in this family for years." The statement was more comprehensive than any he'd made before, and I could see the effort it required for him to fully acknowledge the extent of my achievements. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means more to me than you might realize." "There's something else," he said, his voice taking on a more formal tone that I recognized from his professional demeanor. "I've been thinking about our estate planning, and I think we need to restructure our financial arrangements to reflect the reality of our respective contributions and assets." I was intrigued by where this conversation might be heading, but also cautious about his motivations. "What do you mean specifically?" I asked. "I mean that our current wills and financial structures were created under the assumption that I was the primary breadwinner and asset holder," he explained. "Given what I now know about your wealth and earning capacity, I think we need to work with estate planning attorneys to ensure that your assets are properly protected and that our beneficiary arrangements reflect your preferences rather than my assumptions. The offer was generous and showed a level of respect for my financial independence that I hadn't expected from him. That's very thoughtful, I said, but I should mention that I've already worked with specialists to establish appropriate structures for my assets. I have trusts, offshore accounts, and beneficiary arrangements that protect my wealth and ensure it's distributed according to my wishes. He looked startled, clearly not having considered that I might have already addressed these complex legal and financial issues without his input. "Of course you do," he said after a moment, shaking his head at his own assumption that I would have neglected such important matters. I should have realized that someone sophisticated enough to generate this kind of wealth would also be sophisticated enough to protect it properly. However, I added, I appreciate your offer to restructure our joint arrangements, and I think it would be valuable for us to work together on integrating our separate financial structures in a way that benefits our family while preserving our individual autonomy. The conversation continued well into the evening, covering topics that ranged from practical financial management to deeper questions about how marriage partners could maintain individual identity and accomplishment while building shared lives. It was the kind of substantive discussion we hadn't had in years, reflecting the new foundation of mutual respect and recognition that had emerged from my revelation months earlier. As we prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how profoundly our family had been transformed by the simple act of telling the truth about who I really was and what I'd accomplished. The lazy housewife who had existed only in their assumptions was gone forever, replaced by the reality of a woman who had built something remarkable through her own skill and determination. The next morning, as we drove Thessaly to the airport for her flight to Philadelphia, I felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond financial success or professional recognition. I had raised a daughter who now understood that women could be powerful in ways that weren't always visible, and I had rebuilt a marriage on a foundation of honesty rather than assumption. But perhaps most importantly, I had proven to myself that it was never too late to insist on being seen clearly, to demand recognition for what you've accomplished, and to reshape relationships that no longer served your authentic self. As Thessaly disappeared through the security checkpoint, turning back to wave one final time before boarding her flight to begin her new life as a finance student, I realized that my years of secret success had led to something even more valuable than wealth. They had led to a family that finally saw and valued each other for who they really were, and that was worth more than any portfolio could ever be.